Welcome to the second series of the stories behind the songs with Dave Kittle. Back in 1979, Dave began a radio career at CHEZ 106 in Ottawa, which spanned 17 years. He was one of the on-air voices that I grew up listening to, and he introduced me to new music that literally changed my life. His knowledge and passion for music are inspiring, to say the least. And in this 12-part podcast, Dave talks about 8 of his favorite songs and the history of how those songs came to be. So pull up a chair and join us for the stories behind the songs.
So we're back in the studio. I'm with Dave Kittle, the man, the myth, the legend,
Good morning,
the radio announcer. You're an actor as well. You do some theater. What haven't you done, Dave?
I've never been up in a hot air balloon.
You've never been up in a hot air balloon?
Of all the things that I did in my radio career, and I used to, one of the nice perks about being in radio back in the day when I was you got to do all kinds of neat things.
Yeah.
You got to MC things. You got invited to go to various events. You got to intro bands and go to concerts and do all kinds of promotional things. The one thing I never did that I always wanted to do was go up in a hot air balloon. I went up in a blimp in a blimp one time.
Okay.
The Sanyo blimp, which was a scaled down version of the Goodyear blimp, and it was in town for, I forget, some promotion.
Okay.
And we got to go up in that one time. I got to fly with the Snowbirds one time on Canada Day, which was very cool.
That has got to be an amazing experience.
That was quite an experience. But I never got to go up in a hot air balloon, and I always wished I could have.
Well, why don't you? Why don't you now?
I'd like to.
Well, go do it.
I'd like to.
It's not that expensive,
The thing is, now I'd have to pay for it. Back then, I could have done it for free.
You know, I was once at the airport on Alert Road watching some planes come in with my kid, and we looked up and suddenly there was a hot air balloon that was supposed to land in this giant field behind us. Mm-hmm. And the wind was so bad that day, you could see it was veering toward the airport.
Oh, that's not a good thing.
No, and it actually, they couldn't bring it down in time, and it actually went onto airport property, past the fence, almost by that the hangar, the first air hangar. And there were, you should have seen all the vehicles coming, like the red lights and the sirens. Oh my God!
Well, they say the thing about hot air balloons is you know exactly where you are when you leave the ground, but you have no idea where you're going to come down.
That's right.
You have no idea.
Yeah.
I mean, they can control it in some way, but you're basically at the whim of whatever wind gusts take you. And
100%.
Away you go. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm surprised. Anyway, you should just do it, Dave. You should.
I think that's not a bad idea. Maybe one of these days.
You book a time, I'll give you $5 towards it.
Fair enough.
That way, you're not paying full price for the whole thing.
Fair enough. The other thing I've always wanted to do, a couple of other things I've always wanted to do that I've never done, is I've always wanted to go up in a glider, which I think would be very cool, and skydiving. I've never gone skydiving, and I've always wanted to do it. I don't know why. I've had the opportunity several times to go skydiving.
Okay.
But I've never done it.
Was it fear, or you just...
No, I just, for whatever reason, I just didn't do it.
Okay.
I just didn't do it. But that bucket list, the old thing of bucket list. Maybe one of these days I will.
One of the things on my bucket list is to buy a new bucket.
That's not a bad idea.
Yeah.
Yours probably has a hole in the bucket.
Yes.
Eliza?
Yes. Anyway.
I digress.
I started. It's my fault. So let's take a ride in the hot air music balloon, and now we're high up in the sky beyond the clouds, and talking about you brought a list of some of your favorite songs.
These are songs, Norm, that just I've always liked these songs, and we're going to do this on a regular basis, so we will get into a whole bunch of different stuff. But I like music from the entire era. Well, I like music going back to the days of Sinatra and the big band music, but mostly the rock era. I like stuff from the 50s and the early 60s, but my basic era is mid-60s to the present. And I like all kinds of stuff, but I like rock music. I like a lot of different bands. My favorite bands, the Beatles, the Stones, Steely Dan, Elton John. I love all kinds of bands. But the first song I wanted to talk about today is one of my all-time favorite songs. I think the greatest song ever by the greatest rock band ever, Jumpin' Jack Flash by the Rolling Stones. I think the Stones are the greatest band in history, and I think Jumpin' Jack Flash is the greatest song they ever did of dozens of classic songs. But I like Jumpin' Jack Flash in particular for not only the fact that it's a great song, but the significance of the song, how it was written, and when it came out, especially. Now, 1967 was an interesting year for the Stones. They had their first hit in '64 and were a massively huge band both in Britain and in North America. But in 1967, they stumbled a little bit. February of that year, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were both busted in a very famous drug bust at Keith Richards' country home, Redlands in England. There was a weekend party, excuse me, that both of them attended, as well as George Harrison of the Beatles and his wife Pattie Boyd attended.
Okay.
And on the Sunday of this weekend, shortly after George and Pattie left, because the Beatles at this time were pretty well untouchable by the authorities, but the Stones weren't.
Okay.
The Beatles would have their run-ins with the law a few years later, but the Stones were who they were after. They got busted, and both Jagger and Richards, along with a friend of theirs, an art dealer by the name of Robert Fraser, were charged and convicted of drug offenses. Jagger and Richards both spent time in jail, 1 and 2 days respectively, until they got until their case got appealed and they got out.
Okay.
But anyway, 1967 was a very strange year for the Stones. They also recorded an album called Their Satanic Majesty's Request, which was a bit of a psychedelic experiment by the band.
The title almost sounds like it would be.
Yeah, their Satanic Majesty's Requests. Very famous for its 3D album jacket, which is now a major collector's item. Their 3D album jacket, but it was a bit of a mistake for the Stones. They got away from their roots a little bit and tried to experiment. They were also doing a lot of drugs in those days, and they were not focused. They were splitting from their longtime manager / producer Andrew Loog Oldham, and it was not a particularly good album, although it's aged very, very well. Yeah. You look back on it now, and it's appreciated now by Stones fans a lot more than at the time. But it was not all that well received at the time.
Okay.
It was a bit of an experiment that didn't really go well for the band. Although there are several good songs on it. She's a Rainbow, 2,000 Light Years from Home are both on the album, but it's very disjointed and it's not a great album.
Okay.
Not one of their best. So they were in the doldrums in 1967, and a lot of people kind of thought that the band had lost direction. But in early 1968, they came back big time. They teamed up with a brand new producer, an American by the name of Jimmy Miller, who had previously worked with groups in England called the Spencer Davis Group and others. And they started recording a new album at Olympic Studios in London, their old haunt, a place that they had worked in many, many times before, which would turn out to be Beggar's Banquet. And in the early sessions of Beggar's Banquet, they started working on Jumping Jack Flash, which originated in the studio by bassist Bill Wyman, who was needling around on a piano one day in the studio and came up with the basic riff for Jumping Jack Flash.
Right.
Although he never got credited for it.
Oh,
the song is credited, as all of their material was, to Jagger and Richards.
Okay.
Bill Wyman never got a composing credit for it, although it's pretty well largely known that he was the one that came up with the basic riff for Jumpin' Jack Flash.
Wow, okay.
The lyrics came from Mick Jagger, who one day, he and Keith Richards were at Redlands, and they were up all night writing. And they were woken up the next morning by these footsteps outside the window. And Mick Jagger said to Keith Richards, he said, what's that noise? What are those footsteps? And Keith Richards says, oh, that's just Jack, my gardener. I call him Jumpin' Jack. And Mick Jagger came up with the phrase Jumpin' Jack Flash, wrote the lyrics, they wrote the song,
Jeez.
And they recorded it with Jimmy Miller in the studio. Was released as a single. Jumpin' Jack Flash was released as a single in May of 1968. Less than 6 months after Satanic Majesty's Request was released.
Released, okay.
And they were back in form. They were back in the old Rolling Stones form. It was one of their biggest ever hit singles, although it never made number one in North America. It only got to number 3. Made number 1 in the UK. But it was a huge hit. It's been a staple in their live shows ever since, and it started a run for the Rolling Stones that I think has been unprecedented in rock and roll history of 4 classic albums all in a row. They started with Jumpin' Jack Flash, then they had Beggar's Banquet, Let It Bleed, Sticky Fingers, and Exile on Main Street. 4 of the greatest albums, not only by the Stones, but of any band in rock and roll history in 4 years.
You've been listening to The Stories Behind the Songs with Dave Kittle. Join us again for the next part in this series. Brought to you by Sunholes Music. Download the latest album now at sunholes.com.